On the morning after Richard's funeral, I stood in our kitchen and stared at the coffee pot as if it were the only thing still holding me upright. The house was too quiet, too orderly, as if it had already accepted that he was gone. I hadn't. The smell of his aftershave still lingered in the hallway, soft and familiar, clinging to the air like memory, refusing to fade. People said grief makes time blur, but I felt every second like a grain of sand dragging across glass. Grace Porter, Richard's attorney, called that afternoon. Her tone was polite, careful, like someone stepping through snow, unsure of what lay beneath. "Mrs. Dalton, there are matters concerning Richard's estate that we should discuss. Would you be able to come in today?" Estate. The word sat heavy in my stomach. I'd always assumed our estate was this house. Our 3-bedroom in Boulder with its creaky porch and a yard Richard mowed himself. We lived comfortably but modestly. We didn't take vacations abroad or buy luxury cars. We saved, yes, but Richard always said, "We have enough, Maggie, more than enough." Grace's office was on Pearl Street, sunlight spilling through tall windows onto mahogany desks. She greeted me with a warmth that felt almost rehearsed. There was a stack of files before her, thick as winter quilts, each one labeled with Richard's handwriting. "Your husband," she began gently, "left behind several trusts, accounts, and holdings, properties, stocks, development shares, assets totaling approximately $47 million. For a moment, I thought she had misspoken. 47 what? She repeated it, slowly, as if testing my ability to absorb the number. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do. Richard, my Richard, the man who reused coffee filters, who patched our roof himself, who insisted we drive our old Subaru until the wheels gave out, had somehow been a millionaire many times over. Grace slid a folder toward me. "He instructed that the entirety of the estate be placed in your name, Maggie. You're the sole beneficiary." The words hit me harder than his eulogy had. Sole beneficiary. It sounded final, almost isolating. As Grace walked me through the documents, I saw his careful handwriting everywhere. Notes in the margins, calculations, reminders written in blue ink. He had built quiet empires while I packed lunches, graded papers, and believed we were just another middle-class couple nearing retirement. When Grace finally asked if I had any questions, all I could whisper was, "Why didn't he tell me?" She hesitated. "He left a letter for you. He asked that I give it to you only after we reviewed everything." The envelope was cream-colored, his initials embossed in faint silver. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My Maggie," it began, "you've always believed that enough was enough, and that belief kept me honest. I didn't tell you about the investments because I didn't want wealth to change who we were. You've given me a life richer than any bank account. Whatever comes next, protect it wisely. And remember, our son doesn't need this to become a good man. Let him earn his own ground. You'll know what to do." I pressed the letter to my chest. For the first time since he passed, I cried, not from grief alone, but from disbelief, love, and something close to fear. When I returned home, the house felt different. Every object now seemed heavier, as if it had been hiding secrets too. His old briefcase, the one I almost donated, was locked. Inside, I found more documents, property deeds, dividend statements, business letters signed by people whose names I'd only heard in passing. My husband had built an empire of silence. That night, I sat by the fireplace and reread his letter until the paper grew soft at the edges. Part of me wanted to call Daniel right away, to tell him that his father had left us something extraordinary. But then I remembered the tone in Richard's words. "You'll know what to do." Daniel had always been bright, kind but restless. Money in his hands could be gasoline on dry grass. Richard must have known that too. Our son needed to build his own story, not live off the one his father wrote. So I decided I wouldn't tell him, not yet, not until I was sure he was standing on his own. The next morning, Daniel called, his voice light. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing. I said, forcing a smile he couldn't see. I've been thinking, he continued, about maybe leaving the firm, trying something new, maybe a startup with a friend from Denver. You know, something exciting. That word, exciting, made my pulse quicken. I'd heard it before, right before he drained his savings on a business that never got off the ground. I swallowed. Be careful, honey. Maybe sit with it a bit before making big moves. Don't worry, he laughed. I'm not a kid anymore. After we hung up, I sat there, staring at the photo on the mantel. Richard in his flannel, Daniel as a boy on his shoulders, both grinning under the Colorado sun. I wanted to trust that image, to believe they were still guiding each other somehow. Over the following weeks, I met with Grace several times. She helped me transfer accounts discreetly, explained investment terms I'd never cared to learn before, and promised confidentiality. We built a careful wall between the fortune and my son, but silence, even righteous silence, grows heavy. At night, I'd hear Richard's voice in my head, steady, reasonable, loving, and then Daniel's laughter echoing through the empty house. I felt like a bridge between them, fragile and trembling under the weight of what I carried. Sometimes I caught myself resenting Richard for leaving me this burden of secrecy. Other times, I felt proud, trusted, then guilty for feeling proud. By early spring, I started walking through the neighborhoods where Richard's properties supposedly stood. Small apartment complexes, renovated duplexes, tidy commercial lots. Each one had his touch. Clean lines, modest design, practical beauty. He'd built them the way he built our marriage, quietly, piece by piece, never seeking applause. One afternoon, I stood outside one of his developments near Baseline Road and whispered, "You hid all this from me, Richard. Why?" The wind answered, soft and cold against my cheeks. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Secrets don't always protect. Sometimes they just postpone the pain." Still, I kept his secret. I told Daniel nothing. Not when he mentioned moving in with a woman named Isabella from Denver. Not when he said she was the one. Because love, I'd learned, can make people blind, and sometimes silence is the only light you have left. I first heard her name on a Sunday morning, when Daniel called sounding happier than he had in years. He said her name like a promise, Isabella Grant. He told me she was brilliant, confident, and kind. The way his voice lifted when he said kind made me pause. My son always fell for confidence, but kindness? That was new. I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. I wanted to believe that maybe, finally, life was giving him something pure. When I met her for the first time, it was early evening in Boulder. The sun was setting over the Flatirons, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Daniel had invited me for dinner at his new apartment, one I hadn't seen yet. When I walked in, everything was spotless, almost too spotless. The couch was new, the curtains matched the rug, and there were fresh lilies on the table. My son had never been one for details. I knew immediately whose touch it was. Then she stepped out of the kitchen, holding 2 wine glasses like a hostess in a magazine ad. She smiled, the kind of smile that looks warm from a distance but doesn't reach the eyes. Her beauty was the first thing anyone would notice, but it wasn't the soft kind. She was the sort of woman who looked like she planned every strand of hair, every angle of her charm. "Maggie, I've heard so much about you," she said, walking toward me. Her perfume was sharp, expensive, and somehow cold. She kissed the air near my cheek and held onto my hand a second too long, as if testing something. "All good things, I hope," I answered, smiling back. "Of course," she said. But there was something in her tone, the same tone women use when they're pretending not to judge. Daniel was beaming, completely unaware of the current between us. He started talking about their weekend trip to Denver, the new restaurant they'd tried, how Isabella knew the manager there. As he talked, she leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning my clothes, the small necklace Richard had given me years ago, and finally, the simple watch on my wrist. Her gaze lingered on each thing a little too long. She wasn't admiring. She was calculating. When we sat down for dinner, She made sure to mention where each dish came from: the farmer's market, the local vineyard, the bakery she just discovered. Every word was chosen like a brick in a wall she was building between us. When she asked about my retirement, it wasn't curiosity I heard. It was measurement. "So, Maggie, Daniel says you live very comfortably," she said, tilting her head. "That's wonderful. It must be nice not to have to worry about anything anymore." The way she said comfortable made me feel small, like she was patting my head while checking the locks on the doors. I smiled politely. "I've been blessed. We managed to plan well over the years." "Richard was a smart man," she said, her lips curving in a knowing smile. "I imagine he left you quite secure." It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. As if she already knew the answer, as if she'd been searching for confirmation. My stomach tightened. I looked at Daniel, but he was still grinning, proud of how well his girlfriend and I were getting along. When the evening ended, she hugged me again, her hands cool against my back. "You're always welcome here," she said sweetly. But her eyes were already elsewhere, moving toward the bookshelf, the photos, the small things that told her how my son had lived before her. That night, as I drove home, the sky had gone dark. The mountains were just shadows against the stars. I replayed every word she said, every glance she gave me. There was something deliberate in it all, a kind of hunger that wasn't about love. Over the next few weeks, Daniel called more often, but our conversations were different. He talked about we now. "We like this. We decided that." He mentioned Isabella's business sense, how she wanted to help him organize his finances. Every time he said it, my heart sank a little more. When Isabella visited my house for the first time, she arrived early, dressed as if she were coming to a photo shoot instead of a simple dinner. She praised the house, the wood floors, the artwork, the light, but the compliments felt hollow. Her eyes were never still. They moved across every surface, every picture frame, every closed door. She asked questions that didn't sound like conversation. "Such a lovely home. Did you and Richard own it outright?" "Yes." "That's amazing. You must have made some great investments together." I heard the word investments echo in my head like a warning bell. By the time she left that evening, my smile was starting to crack. I stood at the door and watched her walk to her car, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, her head tilted toward him in a perfect angle of affection. She turned just before getting in and gave me that same practiced smile. I closed the door quietly, pressing my hand against the wood as if to steady myself. There was no doubt left in my mind. She wasn't looking at my son. She was looking through him. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first sting of resentment. Not just toward her, but toward Richard, too, for leaving me the kind of secret that could attract a woman like that. The air in Aspen felt thinner, sharper, almost judgmental. Maybe it was just the altitude, or maybe it was the wedding. Silver Pine Lodge looked like something out of a magazine. Pine trees dusted with early snow, strings of golden lights wrapped around every railing, soft music spilling from the courtyard. I stood on the terrace that evening, watching guests in silk and satin pose for photos while my son smiled like he had just inherited the world. Daniel looked happy, but not the kind of happiness that comes from peace. It was the kind that flickers, built on someone else's approval. And Isabella was that approval. She was radiant, of course. Every step she took drew eyes. Her dress shimmered in the firelight, and the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin lifted, reminded me of a performer about to take her bow. She greeted guests like a politician, every smile measured, every laugh rehearsed. I wanted to be happy for my son. I truly did. But as I watched Isabella glide through the crowd, collecting compliments and controlling the rhythm of the evening, I felt something inside me tighten. She wasn't marrying Daniel for love. She was marrying him for access. And I had just paid $20,000 to help fund her stage. When I offered the check, I'd done it quietly. "For the wedding," I'd said, handing it to Daniel a few weeks before. His face lit up with gratitude. "Mom, you don't have to." "I want to," I'd lied, because at that moment I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. Isabella had smiled when she heard. "That's so generous, Maggie," she said, her voice dripping with something that almost sounded like approval. "We'll make sure every detail is perfect." Every word of hers sounded like sugar, but landed like a stone. During the ceremony, snow began to fall. It should have been beautiful, and maybe it was for everyone else. But as I watched my son standing at the altar, looking at her like she hung the moon, all I could see was the distance between us. The years I spent raising him, the values I taught him, now slipping quietly out of reach. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Isabella turned toward the guests before Daniel could even kiss her. She wanted the applause first. The reception was worse. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter filled the hall, and Isabella floated from table to table like a queen greeting her subjects. At one point, she leaned down beside me, her perfume wrapping around me like smoke. "Everything turned out perfectly, don't you think?" she said. "It's a beautiful night," I replied. "It is," she said, eyes glinting. "And now that we're a family, I hope you'll trust us with some of the bigger family matters. Daniel mentioned you handle most of the financial planning?" I set my fork down slowly. I've managed fine so far. Her smile didn't falter, but her tone cooled. "Of course, but it's a lot of responsibility for one person. Daniel and I are partners now. We make decisions together." I wanted to tell her the truth then, that there were no decisions to make, no inheritance waiting for her claws to sink into. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded and said softly, "You'll learn, dear. Some things can't be rushed." For the rest of the evening, she barely looked my way. When the music started, she danced like the world was her audience. Daniel followed her every move, laughing, trying to keep up. I excused myself after an hour and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but it felt cleaner than the air inside that room. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing everything in silence. I stood there, letting it sting my face, and whispered to the dark, "Richard, what have you left me to do?" That's when I heard it. Isabella's voice, sharp and unguarded, cutting through the night air from behind the stone archway. "Once we're back from Hawaii, I'll make her sign everything. She'll think it's just estate paperwork. Grace said she's old-fashioned. She'll do it without question." The words froze me more completely than the snow ever could. She was talking to her maid of honor, giggling like a schoolgirl plotting a prank. "And after that," she continued, "Daniel and I can finally move things forward. He has no idea how much money she's sitting on. It's ridiculous. She doesn't even spend it." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. That was the moment everything changed. Until then, I'd convinced myself that maybe I was wrong about her, that maybe I was too protective, too suspicious. But those words stripped away every illusion. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. She was exactly what I feared, and worse. I could have stepped out from behind the column right then. I could have confronted her, shouted, ruined her perfect night, but I didn't. I thought of Daniel, his smile, his innocence, the boy who once built model houses on our living room floor. I couldn't destroy his dream in front of everyone. Not yet. So I stayed quiet. I walked back inside, keeping my expression calm, and congratulated them once more before leaving. As I drove down the winding road toward Boulder, the snow thickened, swirling in the headlights. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was already turning, slowly, carefully. By the time I reached home, I knew what I had to do. Revenge wasn't the word for it. This was about protection, about dignity, about Richard's trust. I would not fight her with anger. I would fight her with silence, with patience, with proof. That night, I went into Richard's old study and opened his safe. Inside were the documents Grace had organized, the trusts, the deeds, the investments. I laid them all out across the desk. My hands no longer trembled. The storm outside raged against the windows, but inside, I felt calm for the first time in months. She thought she was marrying into an empire she could control. What she didn't know was that the empire was already fortified, and I was done being the quiet, trusting widow. From that night on, I wasn't just Richard's wife or Daniel's mother. I was the guardian of what they could never take, and the storm, this time, was mine. The first time I saw Isabella after the honeymoon, she didn't knock. I was in my garden trimming the rose bushes when a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. The sound of the engine alone told me this wasn't a friendly visit. The car door opened, and out stepped Isabella in a beige coat, sunglasses too large for her face, and a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. A man followed, tall, polished, holding a leather briefcase. "Maggie," she said brightly, as if we were dear friends meeting for coffee. "We were in the area and thought we'd stop by." The man extended his hand. "Michael Trent. I'm a financial advisor. I work with the Daltons now." The Daltons, plural. I forced a polite smile. "Is that so?" They followed me up the path to the front door. Isabella's heels clicked against the stones, sharp and impatient. Inside, the smell of coffee lingered, but the warmth that usually filled this house felt gone. Isabella looked around like she owned the place, her gaze moving from the antique clock to the framed photos on the mantel. "It's cozy," she said. "Daniel always said you preferred simplicity." Her tone was sugar over steel. I motioned for them to sit. She didn't. Instead, she walked to the window, opening the curtains wider, as if to let in judgment along with the light. "Let's get to it," she said. "Michael has reviewed the Dalton estate plan, and we believe it's time to update it. It's outdated and fragmented. You'll want to transfer a portion to Daniel and me, about $9 million to start, so we can manage things properly. You understand, don't you?" $9 million. She said it as casually as if she were asking for sugar for her tea. I looked at her, then at him. "And what exactly do you think you're managing?" Michael cleared his throat. "Your late husband's portfolio, ma'am, consolidating assets for smoother transitions." I noticed the small hesitation before he said ma'am. He wasn't sure whether to respect me or underestimate me. I decided not to make it easy for him. "I don't recall hiring you," I said calmly, "and I certainly don't recall giving permission to discuss my private finances." Isabella's smile thinned. "Maggie, please. We're family. You don't need to make this difficult. You've done your part. Now it's our turn." There it was, the shift in her voice, the drop of pretense. Her charm was gone, replaced by quiet authority. She believed she had already won. "You're mistaken," I said softly. "Richard's estate is in order. Nothing needs changing." She crossed her arms, that expensive diamond glinting like proof of conquest. "If you refuse, I'll have to take other steps. You've been under a lot of stress, and Daniel is worried about your mental stability. I'd hate for this to become a legal issue." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The threat wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. My son's name, Daniel, in her mouth, used like a weapon. I saw exactly what she was doing. She wanted to paint me as unfit, to force me to hand over everything my husband built. I didn't respond. I reached over, pressed the small recorder under my sleeve, and watched the red light blink once. "Is that what you told Daniel?" I asked. She hesitated. "Daniel trusts me," she said finally. "He knows what's best for everyone." I smiled. "I'm sure he does." When they left, I stood in the doorway and watched the Mercedes disappear down the street. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from fury. She had walked into my home, insulted me, and used my son's name to do it. For years, I had believed silence was strength, that calmness was dignity. But that afternoon, my silence turned into something else. Strategy. As soon as the car vanished, I called Grace Porter. Her voice on the line was steady, professional, exactly what I needed. I told her everything, every word, every threat. Grace didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said only, "You did the right thing. Keep the recording safe. We'll handle the rest." That night I sat in Richard's old study with the rain tapping against the windows. The documents were spread out across the desk again. I replayed Isabella's voice, that cold certainty dripping from every syllable. My resentment burned deeper than anger. She had turned Daniel against me, used his love to blind him, and now she thought she could erase me completely. I thought of the wedding night, of her whispering about signatures and control. I had given her enough time to show her true face, and she finally had. Every move she made from here on would be a trap of her own making. By morning, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and something new, something clean. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the garden. The roses glistened, heavy with rain. The storm had passed, but the ground had changed, and so had I. She thought she could frighten me into surrender, but I had weathered far worse storms than her ambition. She didn't know yet, but the game she started was about to end on my terms. The thunder that night seemed to follow me through the house. Every few seconds, a flash of lightning cut across the windows, lighting up Richard's old study, the room that had become both a shelter and a battleground. On the desk sat the folder Grace and I had prepared, every page in order, every recording labeled. The storm outside was fierce, but the one I'd been holding inside for months was finally ready to break. Daniel arrived first. His face looked thinner, tired. The honeymoon glow had faded, replaced by something uncertain. He hugged me, but it felt cautious, as if he wasn't sure whether I was the mother he remembered or the obstacle Isabella had described. When he sat down, I saw the confusion in his eyes, the kind that comes from being torn between loyalty and truth. "Mom," he began, his voice tight, "Isabella said you've been difficult lately, that you're holding on to things that should be shared." I didn't interrupt. I just nodded, letting him speak, letting his words, her words, spill out. Each one stung like tiny cuts, difficult, controlling, unreasonable. That was how she'd painted me. I'd expected it, but hearing it from my own son was still a knife to the heart. Before I could respond, the front door opened. Isabella's heels echoed across the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, poised and calm, as if she'd rehearsed this moment. Her coat dripped rain onto the hardwood floor, but she didn't seem to notice. "Maggie," she said softly, "we all want what's best for you. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." She was good. Too good. Her voice was smooth, her eyes gentle. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed her. But I'd already heard the recordings, already read the messages she'd sent to her so-called financial advisor. She had planned everything. The manipulation, the power play, even this performance of concern. Grace arrived a few minutes later, umbrella in hand, her expression composed. "Thank you for coming," she said politely to Isabella. "We thought it was time to clear up a few misunderstandings." Isabella's eyes flicked to the folder on the desk, then back to me. "What's this?" she asked, her tone still sweet but now edged with something sharp. I took a breath. "Evidence," I said quietly, "of everything you've said and done. The recordings, the messages, the threats, all of it." For a second, the mask slipped. Her smile faltered, and I saw the real Isabella, the one without charm or control. But then she straightened, recovering quickly. "That's ridiculous," she said, laughing lightly. "Daniel, you don't believe this, do you?" My son looked between us, lost. What is she talking about? Grace stepped forward and pressed play on the small recorder. Isabella's voice filled the room, unmistakable, confident, cruel. "Once we're back from Hawaii, I'll make her sign everything." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Daniel's face went pale. He stared at the device, then at her. "You said that?" he asked, his voice breaking. Isabella opened her mouth, searching for words, but there were none left to twist. Grace laid another document on the desk, printed copies of the text messages Isabella had sent to Michael Trent. "She won't fight me. She's too old to see it coming." That was the moment the storm inside me finally quieted. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to demand anything. The truth was enough. "Daniel," I said softly, "your father trusted me to protect what he built, and I did. But I also needed to protect you from her." He nodded slowly, tears in his eyes, shame clouding his face. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered. Isabella's calm shattered. "You can't do this to me," she shouted, her voice cracking for the first time. "You don't know what it's like to have nothing." I looked at her, feeling no anger left, only a quiet, steady resolve. "You had everything, Isabella," I said, "and you could have kept it if you'd valued love more than control." Grace handed her a sealed envelope. "You'll find annulment papers inside," she said. "Fraud, coercion, and misrepresentation." Isabella stared at us, eyes wide, then turned and stormed out into the rain. The door slammed behind her, and the thunder swallowed her words. Daniel sat beside me, his shoulders shaking. I reached out and took his hand. For the first time in months, he looked at me the way he used to. Not with guilt or hesitation, but with understanding. Later that night, when the storm faded and silence filled the house again, I stood in Richard's study, watching the lights flicker across the wet street outside. My phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "It's done. She won't bother you again." I put the phone down and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, the air in this house felt light, free. Weeks later, an email arrived from a woman I didn't know. She worked at one of the shelters Richard used to support. She wrote to thank me for a donation that had appeared in his name. One of the properties he'd built was now housing families in need. She ended with a line that made me cry. "He built homes. You protected them." I smiled through the tears. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the garden where the roses had just begun to bloom again. I no longer felt invisible. I no longer needed to prove anything. And as I stood there in the quiet, I realized something that would stay with me forever. Sometimes, the loudest kind of revenge is peace. If you've ever had to stand your ground in silence, if you've ever chosen truth over comfort, this story is for you. Because strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I'm still here."